Business was not the only aspect of industrialization that developed during the Gilded Age and into the Progressive Era. The other half of industrialization is labor. Um, just as there had been business and industry prior to the Gilded Age, there was also a labor movement prior to the Gilded Age. So we want to start there, and then I want to discuss how the labor movement developed and some of its manifestations during the Gilded Age, some of its historical trajectory. And I want to end by moving into the Progressive Era with the last gasp of the radical labor movement that actually occurred fully within the Progressive Era. So let's begin with the antebellum labor movements. Prior to the Civil War, when industries which were relatively small and tended to be workshop based, then had some kind of spasm, the business cycle may have had a spasm, or there was some kind of change, and these changes in the antebellum business market are pretty thoroughly documented. Then labor responded, and frequently they responded on the same scale that business had responded to whatever it was responding to. Business acted on a particular scale, labor acted on the same scale. Business and labor were not national during the antebellum period. The nationalization of the economy is part of the Gilded Age. The growth and the scale of the economy changed during the Gilded Age and became more nationalized. So what you see in the antebellum era is not only local business. An industry of shoemakers, for example, really existed just a few in a town or a few in a region. They didn't exist across the face of the nation. And as business existed, so did labor. Not necessarily organized into unions, because unions were considered to be conspiracies. So when labor worked together in what we would today call either a union or an action, then they were local, they were ad hoc. Usually they got together because they were upset with something that the local businessmen had agreed to do, the local manufacturing leaders had agreed to do, and they would do things like strike or slow down, and they had no protection in law. And again, the collusion of business people to deal collectively with their bosses as a group was considered a conspiracy under the common law, and people went to jail for talking about working together and for designing to work together. Well, this went on until 1842. It began to change after 1842, 30 years before our period, in the Massachusetts Supreme Court case of Commonwealth versus Hunt, in which the Massachusetts Supreme Court modernized its dicta and began, or actually declared, that a labor movement in and of itself was not a conspiracy in restraint of trade. That just the fact of talking together did not make it a conspiracy, even of acting together did not make it a conspiracy. And this was the harbinger of slow but steady changes in what laboring groups could do. And how they could organize. Well, because they had been considered conspiracies, and because particularly in antebellum America, we worked our problems out at the political level, then instead of becoming unions like we think of today, working men's associations then became political parties. The Loco Foco Party, that wing of the New York Democratic Party, is a case in point. That was the working men's branch. There was a working men's party at one point. We still see some of this in the old leftover populist parties like the Farmer and Labor Party in Minnesota. But the postbellum labor movement was qualitatively and quantitatively different as enlarged businesses began to spread throughout a national market. And as enlarged industries began to spread throughout the national market, then labor followed suit and began to spread into nationwide or at least multi-regional organizations. And so we begin to see the modern day national labor movement in the immediate postbellum era. Now, what did the labor movement tend to seek? It had some very specific demands that are fairly common all across the board. That even if there were other things that they were working on, some of these have been worked on by political parties, working men's political parties, but in the postbellum era, in the wake of Commonwealth v. Hunt, we see the development of groups that decided not to be political parties, but to be working men's associations that quite literally sometimes did battle with capital, with the owners. But they always had programs, whether they were strikers or fighters or alternative organizations, whatever. They sought amelioration of low wages and poor working conditions. They frequently all sought the 8-hour day. They sought regulation of women's labor and of child labor. They sought immigration restriction. They sought the development of federal and state labor bureaus. These would be statistical gathering organizations, and they sought both economic and political voice rather than just political voice. They added economic voice to the general contours of what they sought. One of the most important nationwide labor organizations, and it wasn't really stretched all the way across the country, but it did have a national presence, is the Knights of Labor. They organized as a secret society under a guy named Uriah Stevens in 1869. They grew with the Depression of the 1870s. And in 1879, the fellow you see here, Terence Powderly, who was considered really good looking, women fawned over him, became the chief of the Knights of Labor and held that office from 1879 until 1890. The Knights had a very progressive agenda. They did not organize as crafts, that is, painters in one union and carpenters in another and electrical workers in another. They organized according to industries. For example, there was a railroad brotherhood of the Knights of Labor, not a brakeman's brotherhood and an engineer's brotherhood. If you worked in the industry, you were in one component of the union. This is called industrial unionism rather than craft unionism. They sought federal and state labor bureaus. They sought to eliminate convict lease systems. They wanted inflated currency, that is currency reform. They wanted mechanics lien laws. That is, when a company went bankrupt, then the employees were first in line to be paid before the creditors were. They sought equal pay for equal work, that is gender equity in payment. And they built themselves around the concept of cooperative buying, the operation of cooperative stores, and the operation of cooperative factories. Remember, this was a heroic age of industrialism. The rules that we operate under today were not set. It was not particularly utopian to say, why should people who put their money into it instead of their sweat into it own it? How about we make a deal where we'll pay you a reasonable return on your money, but we control the management because we're the workers. We actually have more involved than you do because we're risking our entire livelihood by working here where you're risking some of your wealth. This is the labor theory of value that is supported by classical economists from David Ricardo through Karl Marx. And so Powderly and the Knights of Labor had this particularly progressive agenda. Powderly did not advocate the strike. He thought that that was a self-defeating tool, that there was no protection for workers. What he sought was boycotts. If you wanted to pressure an employer to act well, then boycott the guy, don't strike him. And consequently, the Knights tended to, as a national organization, not support strikers adequately. And so they lost many strikes that if they had provided a reasonable level of support, they could have won. And the winning of strikes for an organization like a labor union demonstrates their strength and draws new members to them, making them even stronger. The Knights of Labor peaked in their membership at about 702,000 in 1886, but declined pretty quickly after the Haymarket riots in Chicago of 1886. We'll talk about Haymarket in the next lecture. Another kind of union is one that we still have with us today. The Knights of Labor fell apart after 1890, 1900, but we still have with us the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. You probably know it as the AFLCIO, and that comes because of a division within the AFL that occurred in the 1930s, and then a reunification in 1955. But the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, was a federation of craft unions. It was not an industrial union. The railroad industry, for example, was broken up by craft. If you were a brakeman, you were in the brakeman's union. If you were an engineer, you were in the engineers union. And this sometimes allowed the managers to play one union off against the other. There was central leadership, of course, but because it was a federation, then there was a great deal of autonomy in any of the individual craft unions. However, the AFL, beginning in 1886, eschewed political activity and focused on union recognition as one of its chief demands and collective bargaining at the job site itself as one of its chief demands. It just tried to establish the concept that the union was legitimate, could speak for the workers, just like the company could speak for the owners and managers, and that's union recognition, and that the contract should not be signed between an individual worker in need of a job to feed his family within the next few days, who's at a disadvantage, and a giant corporation. That it should be the sign that all of the workers agree to a particular contract that is negotiated by the union speaking for them. That's called collective bargaining. The American Federation of Labor said, we will not become a working man's political party. And they brought that to fruition under Their longtime original leader, Samuel Gompers, who you see pictured here, except for 1 year, he was the president of the American Federation of Labor from 1886 until his death in 1924. The AFL became the largest American union, getting 500,000 members in 1900, 2 million members in 1914, and by 1920 had doubled to 4 million members, in large part because of its ability to negotiate with the federal government in working out economic issues because of our involvement in World War I. So the reason that the union doubled in size was primarily because the federal government needed to control labor, and the AFL was willing to sign no strike pledges during World War I. The same thing occurred in World War II. The AFL would go on in the 1920s to lose membership. There's a lot of reasons for that. During the Great Depression, it split into the AFLCIO, the Congress of Industrial Organization, and then those two would fight each other just as hard as they fought for the rights of labor against employers until they merged again in 1955. And then basic changes in the law and in the structure of the American economy has led to the not complete demise of unions, but certainly a much weaker labor organization in the United States economy now than there was 100 years ago. The last of these kinds of union, and the Knights of Labor were a particular type of union. The AFL was a particular type of union that was different from the Knights of Labor. The AFL struck. The AFL sought collective bargaining. It didn't care about cooperative stores. It fought employers by themselves or industries by themselves. It wasn't trying to create an alternative to the kind of capitalism that was inherent in the U.S. But then on the very radical end of this spectrum, on which the AFL was probably the far right wing of the labor movement, but on the far left wing was the IWW, which grew out of the Western Federation of Miners. It formed in 1905, which is a little after the time period we're focusing on right now, and it lasted until it was repressed in 1920. This was the radical industrial workers of the world, the IWW. They were anarchists, they were socialists, and don't think that socialism is just statism. There are various kinds of socialism, and there is an anarchist strain of socialism that we see in what we can label syndicalism. That is, workers control the industry. Forget investors, workers should control the industry. They were industrial unionists. The Western Federation of Miners, out of which they grew, organized itself in 1893 in the aftermath of a lot of warring between workers and managers, literal warring with assassinations and bombings and murders and things like this. In 1893, the IWW was marginalized from the very beginning because they were so radical, but they enjoyed some success among marginalized workers, such as timber workers, migrant farm laborers, African American workers, immigrant workers in the East. And they were led for most of their existence by the fellow pictured here, William Big Bill Haywood, a one-eyed, tough as nails miner who was well over 6 feet tall, close on to 300 pounds, mostly of just pure on strength. The biggest success enjoyed by the IWW was in the Lawrence, New Jersey textile strike of 1912. They began failing after they failed in the Paterson, New Jersey textile strike of 1913. In one of the things that the IWW was about was industrial revolution, overthrowing the government of the United States, and they did this in first in free speech campaigns. That was one of their main issues, was the free speech campaign. In 1914, their free speech campaigns ended in suppression, sometimes lynching of IWW members. In World War I, the U.S. Congress passed what they called the criminal syndicalist laws. And these were aimed directly at outlawing the type of organization, social and industrial organization and political organization advocated by the IWW. It was aimed directly at criminalizing what the IWW had been advocating for well over 10 years. Haywood was arrested under the criminal syndicalist laws, and he escaped incarceration, fled to the Soviet Union, where he died in 1928. Now, I'd like to draw your attention, because I think it's interesting and kind of fun, to the advertisement that's immediately above Haywood's picture in this slide. You'll see that the one big union, the IWW, advocating for freedom and industrial unionization, has on its banner the abolition of the wage system and what looks like a pair of wooden shoes. In fact, they are. And this was a symbol that they were willing to break machinery, to sabotage the system. The name, the French and Dutch name, particularly the French name for wooden shoes, is sabot. And French textile workers in the first industrial revolution, in order to break the machinery, would take off one of their wooden shoes and drop it into the rapidly moving wooden machinery, and it would break the machine and stop the production line. And this was called sabotage, tossing your shoe into the machinery, the monkey wrench, as we would call it today. And this symbol appearing on the banner of the one big union, the IWW, then indicates their willingness to go to a certain level of extreme. This concludes our discussion of labor movements, and we will move on from here. Thank you once again.